Another characteristic of populations is that they often have patchy distributions. Okay, and sometimes these patchy distributions of organisms like these collared lizards or plants is because of the fact that they live in areas that are patchily distributed. These photographs are showing examples of what are called glades, which are these kind of rocky outcrop clearings that occur between a wooded area. Here you can see this sort of rocky area surrounded by woods or trees and vegetation. And here's kind of a close-up of one of these glades in the Missouri Ozarks. So the populations of species that live in these glades, like for example Clematis fremonti, has a very patchy distribution, and in this case we can even sort of see patches within patches. So this is the state of Missouri, and this little square here just outside of St. Louis is what we're looking at here, and this is kind of a scale of 10 miles. And if we were to choose a group of glades within this area, we see within the region there's a large number of them, and that if we take a smaller chunk, a small glade cluster within the larger grouping of glades, we can maybe look at a single glade over here, and then even within a single glade we can look at the fact that if we look at these little red dots here, and that's the distribution of Clematis fremonti, that even those guys are sort of aggregated together within a glade. Okay, so we see patches within patches within patches, right? We've got a cluster of this over this large geographical range. We have regional clusters, we have a small group of clusters and a single glade, and then an aggregation of individuals within a glade. And again, these patchy kinds of distributions are more of a rule than they are an exception. Another example is of looking at the range of kangaroos in Australia. And what you can see is that the abundance of this species can vary throughout its total geographical range. Right, so this whole area of the dotted line, trying to draw in green here, is the geographical range of kangaroos, right? The limits of its distribution, and then it's limited in these internal spaces here for a number of different reasons. But that you can see the relative density, if you look at the values here, you can see that it's very dense in certain areas and not so dense in other areas. So the relative abundance, if you say what's the relative abundance of kangaroos, well, again, it's going to depend on where you're looking, because it's such a broad geographical range that the abundance of these kangaroos is limited by different factors in these different areas to end up with this very sort of patchy distribution of densities. So I mentioned dispersion patterns a couple of times, and there are sort of three general categorizations of dispersion that ecologists recognize. These clumped distributions where organisms are aggregated together, and let me tell you just to start with that this is actually the most common kind of dispersion that you see. But we also see dispersion patterns where organisms are more regularly spaced. You see them at quite regular intervals, like these albatrosses here. And we're going to talk about what are some of the reasons for these different dispersion patterns. And just to give you a little bit of a hint, we can think about how there may just be a water hole in this desert in one place and not in another. Okay? And birds like albatrosses may have competition for different kinds of resources. All right. A third pattern is just random, where we see organisms that are distributed without respect to any particular kind of pattern. So when we see a pattern, what we want to ask is, what are the processes that could cause these patterns, right? Why do we have clump distributions? Why might we have a nearly regular or uniform distribution of these different organisms, whether it's vegetation, whether it's animals, whether it's plants? By now you should already think about what some of the reasons for clump distributions are, because we talked a lot about grouping and social behavior. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing that here, but remember all the ways in which group living can afford protection from predators, right? And how cooperative prey capture. Sometimes organisms are clumped because their resources are clumped, right? If you eat a particular plant or feed on a particular plant and you're this kind of an insect, then you're going to have to be where those plants are, and so your distribution ends up clumped as well. Okay, we've talked about mating, clumping together in order to be able to find mates, and that there may also just be an inability for certain organisms to disperse into different environments. So these barriers to dispersal mean that you end up all clumped up next to each other. What are some reasons for uniform distributions or regular distributions? Well, these uniform or regular distributions are often seen in species that occupy territories, right? Territoriality is a really important way in which we see this kind of uniform spacing. So some organisms, instead of just going out and foraging, they'll protect a territory that contains their food resources, that can contain mates, that can contain nesting sites, and other kinds of resources, maybe water, that are important to them. And so as each animal is trying to maintain a territory of maximum size, and there's a lot of energy that goes into fighting in order to maintain a territory, they end up with this kind of more or less regular distribution. Even plants can be territorial in a sense, or competitive certainly, in the fact that they produce these kinds of chemicals called alleochemicals. We'll talk more about those later, but chemicals produced by plants can actually be harmful to other plants. So they basically produce these herbicides, these compounds that keep other plants from growing near them. Okay, and obviously humans often plant plants in very regular rows, like corn rows. Random patterns are actually not quite as common, but come about from a number of reasons that you might see. Some kinds of organisms, especially plants, are distributed by the wind. The seeds, rather, are distributed by the wind. Propagules being that type of offspring, whether if you can imagine like dandelion seeds or other kinds of seeds that are wind dispersed. If you're talking about aquatic organisms, that larvae end up in currents, okay? Herbivores that eat fruits will eat the seeds and then poop somewhere else and disperse those seeds into a different environment. And so the random distribution of propagules, like eggs and seeds, it can be a reason for why organisms end up randomly distributed, because once they're there, they just kind of stay there. Certainly human disturbances can cause random distributions. People building, construction, development can be random with respect to the natural organisms that live there. Natural disturbances like hurricanes, tornadoes, other things, volcanic eruptions can cause random distributions. The fact that there may not be a lot of interaction between species, all right? There's certainly we're going to talk more about interactions like competition and predation, but in some cases, some species are not interacting with each other, and so they may be more or less randomly associated with each other. Just to talk a little bit more about territoriality and territory size. For example, snowy owls, they maintain territories that they guard and they hunt in and they try to keep other snowy owls away from. And so especially the snowy owl here who's trying to hunt for lemmings, okay? And what you see is that as the lemming density is really high, the territory size is smaller. This is what we mean by the fact that the territory size is inversely correlated with lemming density, okay? So let's think about that for a minute. If you have a high amount of prey available, you might not need your territory to be that huge. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's an example in territory size in nuthatches. And a lot of birds are territorial. Red-winged blackbirds, nuthatches, a number of other kinds of birds spend a lot of time and energy kind of calling with each other, fighting with each other, trying to maintain these territories. And what you can see in this diagram here is that when food densities are really high, when it's been a high masting year, trees that produce seeds all at one time, we talk about masting. When there's a very heavy mast crop, the territory sizes of these guys tend to be kind of small. So each one of these territories would be occupied by a single bird fighting and keeping the other ones away. Right? But when food density is low, they might have to occupy a much larger territory. And why is that? Well, if food is more scarcely or sparsely spaced, you need a larger territory in order to gain access to enough resources for your survival, growth, and reproduction. Okay, so we can look at this pattern: high food density, small territories; low food density, large territories, and ask a mechanistic question. So we take the observation about the relationship between territory size and food density, ask a question: why do large territories are around when the food densities are low? Come up with a hypothesis, right? Design an experiment. And maybe if we were in class, we would do that. But what I want you to do is sort of think about the observations, questions, hypotheses, and predictions that you could come up with in terms of designing an experiment about territory size, food density, and nuthatches. So the bottom line, and a point that I just want to be sure to reiterate, is that when we go out there and we make an observation, right, we see the type of dispersion. Either it's a regular pattern, maybe a clump pattern, maybe a random pattern, and then we can ask the question, what's causing the dispersion, right? So the type of dispersion or the pattern can actually indicate the processes that have caused the pattern. If I see a clump species, that may indicate that I have a socially organized animal. And that's just one example. And if you think about relationships between patterns and processes, it's not completely unlike what you've learned about structure and function. You look at the structure of an animal in terms of its anatomy, in terms of its teeth, and say, what's the function? Is it an herbivore? Is it a carnivore? So patterns and processes, structure and function, these kinds of relationships go together. We also talked about the example of looking at variation within populations, and what does that tell us about their evolutionary historical environment? Okay, that it may be specialists or generalists may tell us something about the consistency of that environment over a long period of time. So again, hopefully what I'm trying to do is get you to think about the fact that we make observations, we have data from other kinds of experiments, and we can learn about processes from patterns that we see.